Well, Laoise de Brún, welcome to the NatCon Australia podcast.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me on.
No problem. I first became aware of you, I think, when you did an interview with Tucker Carlson around about the time of a proposed constitutional amendment in Ireland, which, if I understand correctly, sought to, amongst other things, get rid of the term motherhood from that document. But for those who are unfamiliar with you, who are you and what do you do?
I am a mother of three, a barrister, and a campaigner. And I founded the Countess, which is my organization. I'm the CEO and founder of the Countess. And I founded the Countess in 2020. Well, we launched in 2020. We were kind of, I would say, zooming in secret for some time before that to scope out what we were and what we wanted to do, how we were going to do it, how we we're going to approach the problem. And prior to that, really, I had sort of joined the dots, if you want to call it that, with regard to gender ideology or trans ideology and how it impacted all areas of life and law and biology, really from 2018 onwards. And I was in the process of relocating back to Ireland and also coming back to the law. So lots of things dovetailed for me really at the same time in my personal life and my kind of political activism. I was I wouldn't say I was a reluctant activist because that's not quite true. I had absolutely no choice. I felt compelled to do what I was doing. I was kind of getting an all body reaction to what I could see was the impact of trans ideology on so many aspects of life. I felt it was a radical reordering of society. I felt it was highly destructive and damaging to the rights of parents, um, and to vulnerable young people, including LGBT young people. So I could really see it in the round, like so many of us. And I couldn't believe that no one was going to do anything in Ireland. And the thing that propelled me to set up my organization in Ireland was I was still living in London. I came back for the rugby for Wales, Ireland in the Six Nations, and we were having dinner afterwards, after the match. And so we were with close friends, like the godparents of our children, really close friends.
Mm.
And I brought it up. I mean, at the time I was talking about nothing else, in fairness. Like my husband used to say, you've ruined another dinner party. Because the thing is, when you go down the rabbit hole, you can't believe how bad this is. And you want to tell the culture. And one of the
Mm.
biggest early shocks as an activist is the culture doesn't necessarily want to know, or the culture has been kind of brainwashed. But in this case, I brought it up as usual because I just have that sort of personality. And everyone at the table, all these Irish people, because I'd been discussing it in London, everyone just went and just froze and looked at the table and said nothing. And I remember very specifically a chill going through my body. And I thought, wow, they're afraid to even utter an opinion.
Mm.
They are afraid to even say anything. And I thought, wow, we're really being managed in Ireland by the media, and this is not okay. And regardless of how you feel about it, you have to be able to discuss it in a liberal democracy. So that's why I founded the Countess, and that was 5 years ago now.
Right. I mean, there has been a pushback in the UK, a successful pushback, I think, in some areas in regard to gender ideology. Some famously dubbing it turf Ireland. Has there been the same level of success in Ireland yet?
No, I'm sad to say there hasn't been. It's not on a par. Um, and the reason is there's a few different reasons for this, and some are kind of structural, and some are cultural, and some are the kind of political and media landscape. So I can get into that. So, firstly, when it comes to the law, one of the most stunning successes, culminating in the Supreme Court ruling, which was last March, I believe,
Mm.
um, really in Ireland, there's a few structural differences. So the first one would be we have different rules on standing. Our locus standi rules are harder. Um, it's a higher threshold to overcome. You must be personally impacted by the policy decision or law that you are challenging, be that through a judicial review or a constitutional challenge, a plenary summons in the High Court. So, so it's much harder to find someone. Also, our courts award adverse costs if you lose. So you'll have to pay the other side's costs if you lose your challenge. So like that's a huge impediment to anyone taking a case. And we say generally in Ireland, as lawyers, we will always note that the people taking challenges to the state are often the people on benefits, the people of straw, because like it's or indeed like the multimillionaires.
mm,
But the middle class people who have mortgages to pay and houses they could lose are not the ones challenging the state. And I think that's probably to the detriment of our country and our democracy in general. But that's really why there hasn't been the same success in terms of lawfare. Like in England, different groups have taken cases, be it challenging local education authorities, be it lesbian groups challenging the right to free association. Um, and obviously the latest case, or the very famous case, the kind of iconic case, really was the Keira Bell judicial review, which precipitated the review of the Tavistock, the biggest gender clinic in the world,
mm,
ended up with the Tavistock being shut down and the permanent banning of puberty blockers. And there's obviously the CAST report. So you can see there is a beautiful domino effect from these legal decisions.
mm,
But we haven't got to that stage yet for the reasons I've outlined. Also, what I've realized is in the 5 years I've been looking for a case, looking for a test case, because obviously that's how I would like to play it as a barrister. And I think there's nothing quite like hearing the trans argument forced into open court, because as you and I both know, I mean, they don't do very well when interrogated in open court, and kind of that has to be the end goal for all of us activists all around the world.
mm,
But the other reason is I realized you kind of have to have an activist heart to take a case, to want to kind of give so much time and emotional resources to something like this and let it take over your life. So it's finding someone who we're not short of women who've been impacted in Ireland. I list off loads of examples. I know of adolescent girls being forced to change in front of adolescent boys in school. I know of cases of men walking around uh, full frontal naked in changing rooms in gyms in Ireland. I know of multiple cases where things are happening, but quite often I'll get in touch with the woman impacted, but then she'll just want to get on with her life. She'll kind of just disappear into the ether. That will commonly be my experience. So, but I've some good news. I know of three test cases which are um, at some stage of, one of them has already been listed for the High Court. One of them has just been announced. The other one is at the kind of nascent stage, but has all the ingredients that I've just outlined.
mm,
So, I think we are entering that phase in Ireland in this jurisdiction of lawfare, and that is absolutely what we need to do. But in terms of other wins, I mean, I'd like to say that my organisation, Countess, I'd like to think, has been instrumental because, for a start, because I'm a journalist, I felt it was really important to instill extreme discipline online and to view this as an information war as much as anything else. And
mm,
so we've just been pumping out content across 5 different social media channels and running campaigns.
mm,
And one of our early wins was we've a good team of researchers, and we discovered that the government were trying to remove the word woman from maternity legislation. And this is like primary legislation from 1984, around about the time when most Western countries would have brought in anti-discrimination when it pertains to pregnancy.
mm,
And our government was retroactively and aggressively about to amend that primary legislation via a post-COVID work-life balance bill.
mm.
And we only saw it because they had it in the heads of the bill. And someone on my team spotted it and they were like, "Oh, have you seen this?" And they were trying to remove the word woman retroactively from maternity legislation, and by taking out the word woman and putting in pregnant people.
Yeah.
So we were
Mm,
horrified. I mean, I think as a woman, as a campaigner, there's something so visceral about when they come for our language. Most of us are mothers, and the fact that we're told we're not mothers or we're not women, we're pregnant people, it's quite a sort of psychic assault, I would put it that way. So, I started gathering testimony from mothers. I had this idea that the words don't belong to the state, they belong to us, and I just had this copy in my head, this kinda, um, campaign copy just came to me, and the idea was these words belong to us, they don't belong to the state. The Irish women have, um, paid a high price historically for being women and mothers, and, these words are our words. So I gather testimony from women of all generations, women who had lost their jobs under the marriage ban,
Mm.
who'd lost babies, when they were encouraged to have endless children. This is women who, in poverty, let's say. It opens with a story of a woman describing her mother putting up the Christmas tree with a little white box on the kitchen table. And she says, she had to just get on with it. She's just lost a little boy, but she had to get on with it. So it's the stories. But what happened when I was making that was some of the survivors from the homes came forward and they wanted to be involved. So it became a kind of, I felt sort of sacred work, really. But
Mm.
because of that, public opinion got behind us. And luckily, we defeated that amendment. It didn't go through. And so that was an early win. And it kind of gave us some confidence to keep going.
Yeah. I mean, it surprises me. Well, I guess nothing surprises me really in this debate now. But you've got a neighbouring country, English speaking, the UK, which obviously it's separate to Ireland, but there's a lot of exchange between the two of them, and the successes and legal and otherwise that they've had there haven't flowed across, or there's been no kind of ripples that have um, made their way, or people haven't thought to themselves in Ireland, geez, if they're doing that there, then maybe we should reconsider our approach here.
To be honest with you, it's been the opposite at
Really?
a kind of official Ireland level. I would describe official Ireland as obviously the Oireachtas, our parliament, upper house, lower house, um, but also the academy, the MGO, um, industrial complex, and the media. And you can kind of treat them all as a bubble, a kind of homogenous bubble. And they certainly manage the official narrative in Ireland. And if anything, I would say at a grassroots level, the extraordinary success in Turf Island has inspired me and other activists like me. But at an official level, I would say that it's the opposite, that they have they're riven with this sense of exceptionalism. And the
Mm.
exceptionalism comes from a disordered relationship with our, dare I say, post imperial master. So there's a sense of kind of a weird um maybe it's a hangover from colonialism, inferiority complex, but it's like, well, whatever we do, we're not going to do what they do. And initially, it was likened to Brexit. Well, we're not going to do what the Brexiteers do, and then it was we're not going to do what the Tories do. And now that Labour are in power, I think that's a much harder argument to make. They can't really
Yeah.
say, "We're not gonna do what Keir Starmer is doing. We're not gonna do what the Labour Party's doing," because there's obviously Ireland is very much, there's a very much a ruling Liberal elite, like the parties have all, um, drifted to centre left.
I g I
Um,
get I get that dynamic between Ireland and England. I think I remember reading an Irish historian saying somewhere that if the UK, if Britain had stayed Catholic, then Ireland might have become Presbyterian, just to be different. But it doesn't, even in Australia, which doesn't quite have the same hang-ups, the Cass report and the Tavistock closure and everything else, and the redefinition of Supreme Court decision, it might as well be the planet Mars. It hasn't really had any huge impact here. There are signs of, there are celebrity cases like Dr. Gillian Spencer and Sal Grover, and I guess more redeeming as well, that was indirectly related to that issue. But there's the birth certificates are still possible to change if you feel like changing your sex 40 years afterwards, and there's no obvious signs of pushback really on that issue, although anyone who follows the news thinks that, internationally thinks there should be, but it just hasn't happened yet. And so I guess Ireland's in exactly the same boat.
and I think in Ireland, part of it as well is, I mean, so much of this is coming from Europe,
Mm.
and we have, better or worse, chosen our new master, and that is Europe. And also there's an element that's more nuanced. Like, there's a saying that goes that when we're a poor country with rich politicians, and now we're a rich country with poor politicians. And I think that's quite true. I think in the 80s, when we were kind of a dirt poor country, relatively speaking, to the rest of Europe, we had clever politicians who were, um, intellectually, they were heavyweights. And so they would go to Europe, and the relationship was Europe. Europe was very much about getting what we could get for the Irish people, and negotiating a position and having an Irish position and lobbying for that position and maybe fighting it out in the chamber, briefing our media, briefing our committee. None of that process occurs anymore. Our politicians are like foie gras geese with their feet nailed to the floor, ingesting an endless diet of just a conveyor belt, really, of legislation from Europe. I mean, 80% of our legislation comes directly from Europe, and we have no choice but to transpose that. So, really, the legislature are just cutting and pasting.
But
Uh,
some countries in Europe have pushed back, right? They're not. It's not. It seems to be that some countries can buck the trend, but Ireland, some countries just accept what comes through from Europe as well, right? I mean, I feel like, yep.
yeah, I mean, European law is instructive. So, if there's a council directive or framework, we will have to transpose that. But there is some leeway, and there's
Mm,
always the margin of appreciation. And I think what's happening since Britain has left Europe, which there was a bit of gleefulness in Ireland, that kind of, oh, look what they've done now. They've left Europe. But I mean, it's clear to me, to our massive detriment, is the
mm,
absence of Britain. Like, not only did they offer thought leadership, and they were obviously the drafters and the crafters of some of the most iconic pieces of legislation that has ever
mm,
come out of Europe, which we all live under and enjoy. But they had a level of skepticism which imbued their perspective with some restraint and offered restraint on the kind of extreme the kind of instincts of Germany, let's say. And I think now there is a power vacuum, and Germany has moved into that power vacuum. And so
mm,
what's happening now, to give you a good example and a case study, we were told to transpose Council Framework 2008 against xenophobia and racism, as very typically in Ireland. It was meant to be done by 2010. We didn't try and even do it till 2020, 10 years later, dragged our feet for 10 years. And now we've kind of overdone it because we brought in gender as well. We didn't need to bring in gender. That was not our instructions from Europe. We brought in gender. But thankfully, because of our campaigning on the ground, the Countess and another great group called Free Speech Ireland, we kind of raised our head of steam and public opinion. And then what happened was, as it moved through the houses, a handful of independent senators in the upper chamber in our Senate, they debated it. They tried to filibuster it, but it was guillotined. But by the time that process had taken hold, there was too much public opinion against it, and backbenchers revolted, essentially. Not revolted per se. We have a very strict whip system in Ireland. They can't really revolt, but they did create so much noise at parliamentary party level that it just became too much of a hot potato, and the hate speech element was dropped. So we have dropped the hate speech element, but lo and
mm.
behold, Commission tell us off in one of their opinions. This is only a few weeks ago, and they say, Ireland, tut tut, rap on the knuckles, you haven't transposed this correctly. Now, I have some good news, and hopefully it's a paradigm shift. Our new Minister for Justice has written and said, no, we're perfectly happy with how we transposed it. And I hope we can do more of this. We need to use this muscle more, and more countries in Europe need to do that, because the thing is, I am a proud European, but I feel like if Europe continues in this new trend of like trying to harmonize the criminal codes of member states, even with regards to contentious social issues like immigration and like trans, it will create fault lines. In fact, it could damage the whole project long term.
Mm. Yeah, I must admit, and I'm a lawyer as well, but I always find discussions about following EU directives from a nation state, it sounds like it's just a completely foreign. Well, it's not completely foreign. We're bound by obviously international obligations and the like, but it's that on steroids. The way that European states talk about following directives that come out of Brussels. I mean, that's not how we kind of operate anymore, and or never really did in Australia. So, well, just don't not to overlabor the point, but you mentioned before, the almost visceral reaction against changing, against motherhood, right? And that was central to this constitutional amendment campaign. And I just wonder, I have Irish heritage, and the motherhood, I mean, every country loves their mums, right? But it is very central in Ireland. The famous Patrick Pearse poem, Lord Dada hard on mothers, right? And it's called The Mother before he was executed. And it's very central. A lot of the campaigns, the sort of matriarch walking and the children and stuff. There hasn't been I don't know, that hasn't been able to be exploited to show the consequences of what gender ideology will bring in Ireland. I'm just wondering if this is possible to tap into that sort of, um
I'm just gonna pull up
yeah,
41.2 actually, if you don't mind.
okay.
I don't wanna say I wanna say it verbatim to you. So we have so I think the interview you saw was when I did Tucker Carlson on the referendum.
Mm,
And essentially, the government was trying to rip out an article out of the Constitution, and replace it with some kind of just vapid, vacuous, um, rewritten clause, rewritten article, s likening mothers to carers and
mm,
saying that, essentially, there's no such thing as motherhood or mothering as a concept,
mm,
not only culturally or sociologically, but also worth protecting in law. And they also lied to the electorate saying, this is the women in the home article. It forces women to stay in the home, which was completely untrue. Um, and so essentially, we had written in our constitution, we have a written constitution that was written in 1937. It enshrines the Catholic faith, it enshrines the family as being predicated on marriage.
mm,
Um, and last of all, it completely elevates motherhood.
mm,
And for me, those are three things worth defending.
mm.
But it was really a David and Goliath kind of situation because there's almost 40,000 NGOs in Ireland, and
Yeah, right.
only two of them were against the proposed amendments. Sinn Féin, the opposition party, plus two governments of parliament, governments, two parties of government, were all pro the changes. The change in marriage would have essentially redefined marriage to make it a durable relationship, which can mean anything, obviously. And what happened was there's a silent majority of people in Ireland, like it's still uh, the norm to get married, and it's still the norm to wait until you're married to have children.
Mm,
And even though at an official Ireland level, there seems to be this march towards a radical progressivism, it's not really reflected in the values of the people, I don't think. And when it comes to marriage and when it comes to motherhood and how we feel about mothers, there was just a huge chasm between what the government was trying to do and how people reacted. But like we had teams in 30 locations for 7 weeks. And because the campaign was so dishonest, run by government, we kind of had to explain what they wanted to do, how they were going to rewrite the constitution, what that would mean, and then what we wanted to do to maintain the status quo, to conserve what was there. And essentially, the rights, there are enforceable rights that reside in 41.2. I'm just going to basically, I'm trying to find the. It's funny when you look it up, it's very hard to actually find because I think they're trying to.
Yeah, no,
No, I'm kind of cynical sometimes when you look it up. Why are there all these other spins on it? From all the um. Anyway, I know it. I don't. I
yeah, no,
shouldn't.
no, no problem. I mean,
It
it
says, but the state recognizes by her work in the home that
mm,
the common good couldn't be achieved. Um, the common good couldn't be achieved, and that her contribution from her work in the home is part of the common good. The common good couldn't be achieved by the state without it. So it recognizes it. And then the second part is, which is quite radical, and I would even argue quite socialist, it says that the woman shouldn't be forced to economic necessity to work outside the home.
mm,
And then the last bit is the only bit that I find rankles a little bit because it's very old-fashioned and patriarchal and, kind of, uh, it's just slightly irritating. But I mean, I can live with it. I can live with it because it's just the wording of the time. It says, to the neglect of her duties in the home.
mm,
But the point is, what it's trying to say, what it is saying is, and I've never seen this written down anywhere in my life, that the state recognizes the unpaid labor of mothers in the home. And
mm,
it's so fundamental and profoundly important that the common good, that it's the bedrock of everything,
yeah,
raising families and running households. And so I would be a maternal feminist. I was at home with my babies until I was called to the bar, and I was never happier in my life. And I don't understand why society has decided to denigrate that. And I think, second, the end result of second wave feminism was this idea of telling a whole generation of women, you might want to be at home with your small children, but that's not esteemable and that's not useful. Get out, put them in a creche and get out and work. That's the only way to have equality. And that is what feminism is. And I really reject that. And I reject
mm,
my government using feminist slogans to try and tell women that, there isn't a beautiful recognition there. And also enforceable rights. There are enforceable rights that reside in 41.2. I'll give you a good example. In other jurisdictions, if you've been a stay-at-home mom your whole life and you get divorced, you'll have to go out and work. In Ireland, if there are resources for you to maintain, for that situation to be maintained, the courts will enforce that. We call it proper provision. Proper
mm.
provision has to be made for the woman who was at the kitchen sink and holding the fort.
Yeah, it is. It is. I don't know the full history, but it just is interesting and possibly somewhat unique. There's nothing like that in Australian law, emphasising the importance of the home and the care that mothers give to children in the household. It is an interesting one, and I'd be kind of curious about more about the background to it. But moving on though, because you've also been a critic of mass immigration in
Yeah.
Ireland. That's also something that's hit the UK and elsewhere. Is there a relationship between the gender ideology stuff and mass immigration? Is there something that links them?
I'd view them both as sacred cows, as
Mm,
sacred pillars of the new radical progressivism that has just taken hold in the Anglosphere.
mm,
Um, I've thought about this so much, and clearly there's a whole swathe of people making a hell of a lot of money from, the industrial complex that is the hotels, the IPAS centers, um, the the industry around putting up people who are 80% of whom who come to Ireland are not are not meeting the threshold of being actual refugees. 80% of whom are coming from the UK, from a safe country. Um, so very clearly these people are looking around and, you know, deciding who has the best benefits. I mean, we've an extraordinary welfare state in Ireland when it comes to job seekers. Now, my understanding is they're not on full job seekers, but they are on a stipend and they have 3 meals a day and they put up with hotels and they're not paying bills, compared to a sort of an Irish person who is struggling to put petrol in the car and, you know,
mm.
do the weekly grocery shop and pay the highest electricity bills in Europe. So, in terms of are they connected? I think they're connected insofar as they are both extremely damaging to society, and I increasingly view them as psyops because they are psychological operations insofar as we are being encouraged and compelled to not to dissent, not to inquire about what this means for our society. With trans, obviously, it's completely destructive of parents' rights, of the rights of LGBT young people, of women's rights. It's catastrophic for women's rights and for child safeguarding. But also on a deeper level, it's kind of an attack on empiricism, and you know, it's an ontological attack on women and the discrete sex classes women, as well as being a catastrophic attack on their safety and dignity and privacy. But I think also there's something deeper at play whereby, it kind of damaging in terms of our really innate understanding of who we are as human beings, that sex is binary and immutable. And similarly with mass force immigration, I mean, this feels like it's kind of there's a psyops element to it insofar as, our Taoiseach recently said, oh, there was never an homogenized Irish race. There's no such thing, which goes against our conception of our history, but also even our mythology, which are very much interlinked in Irish culture.
Mm.
And he said, we're just an island of mongrels, or a race of mongrels. So there's this sort of denigration of the of us as a race, but also of the nation state.
It's very much.
The
I view them as it's an attack of them both these issues as an attack on identity,
Mm.
one being the nation state and the other being, a sex, and the other being an attack on limits. There are no limits there are no borders, there are no definitions. They're just ever expanding depending on what you want them to be. Project whatever identity you want on this blank canvas, whether it be a nation or an individual. And that's not, and whether you want to describe that as a sort of liberalism gone wild or neoliberalism or progressivism, I think that's, in my view at least, that's sort of, it's just this notion that there can't be limits and definition, and any limits placed on it are somehow an infringement of individual freedom, and therefore they must be abolished. That's my sort of shorthand summary for how they're linked. Is that fair? Do you think?
Yeah, I think you've hit onto something there for sure. I see the similarity with regard to boundaries, you know?
Mm.
What are our fundamental boundaries? Like, is it okay to have borders? Is it okay to have female-only spaces?
Mm.
You know, these are things that were just held as fundamental pillars of functioning societies up until, like, last week. And now they're crumbling, and we're being encouraged to let them crumble. And to whose benefit is that? I mean, are we just consumers, or are we custodians of, our society, our culture, of the country we wanna hand down to our grandchildren?
Yeah, it's a completely different conception. It's you're passing on a a heritage to the next generation, whereas liberal mind seems to think, well, it doesn't matter in 50 years' time what the people or language or religion or they speak, as long as they accord with these abstract liberal axioms. And well, I doubt you'll get the liberal axioms anyway, even in 50 years' time, if you completely change the demography. I chatted with Michael Murphy, a journalist from the UK Telegraph, who has Irish heritage, and I'm sure you're familiar with, about 3 months back. How things have how have things progressed since then? Because in the UK, it seems like protests have grown. There've been a few high profile incidents, but I haven't heard as much out of Ireland. But maybe it's just because it hasn't been broadcast, or I haven't been focused on it enough.
Um, I mean, he and I would agree that we need, 2 things to happen. We need politicians, mainstream politicians, to take note and, um, stop kind of cleaving to the official narrative around this, and reflect what people on the ground are saying. But we also need, it's kind of threefold really. We need it reflected in the media correctly, because it's not. I see the same playbook as trans, whereby we've been drip fed a propaganda diet of kind of, um, either success stories or sob stories that manipulate the masses. We're not being encouraged to join the dots. We're not being encouraged to ask the big questions about how this impacts us. Ireland has seen a 13% increase in sex offending in 1 year, and data on ethnicity of sex offenders is held by An Garda Síochána, our police force, but it's not disaggregated. And I will be calling for that to be released as a matter of urgency, because we can't make policy if we're all kept in the dark. Myself, as a women's rights campaigner, I see mass force immigration into my country in the same way I see trans. They're both an existential threat to the rights, safety, and freedom of women and girls. And the data from Europe is so clear. Like, when you look at the data from Germany, after Angela Merkel's campaign, Wir schaffen das, we can handle this, and our open door policy, which led to, I think, 1 million in a few years coming in, the rates of gang rape of German women and girls doubled. It's doubled. It's now at 2 recorded gang rapes a day in Germany. And the top 3 offenders in terms of ethnicity are Afghan, Syria, and Turkey, men from those 3 countries. And likewise in Sweden, the longitudinal study there shows that they are men convicted of rape in Sweden are 4 times more likely to come from those countries, and to not be born in Sweden. So are we to say in Ireland that when we allow these men onto our shores, there's something special and magical about Ireland? And the second that their feet touch the ground in Ireland, you know, I wouldn't say shore necessarily. We don't have boats coming, but as soon as they arrive in Dublin Airport or cross the border, more likely from Belfast, that they suddenly are imbued with the kind of sensibilities of Irish men, and that they don't look at women in the West and they don't look at Irish women as, let's say, worst case scenario, fair game, because these men are from cultures where it's the respectable women in conservative Muslim countries, respectable women are segregated and they are shrouded and they are constrained outside the home. And I see it as an existential threat because Irish women, I mean, I drink pints and I tell stories, and we are very much given that kind of latitude in Ireland. We're very much, we mix freely, and um, I'm concerned that there's a there's a there's a there is a risk of opportunistic rape. I think also there's a low level thing that happens, which is just women being harassed at bus stops and in parks. And then because of that, younger girls, like I let my, you know, um 8-year-old and 10-year-old go to the local park together. But like if something happens, that will stop and they will lose that freedom. And that's one of the reasons I relocated back to Ireland, for the safety element. And I think also the big issue again, the third issue, is grooming gangs. We already have evidence of cars being pulling up outside residential care homes in Ireland. Nobody seems to be doing anything about it. But I mean, the Louise Casey report was very, very clear in England.
Mm.
Those men were 4 times more likely to be from Pakistan in three of the audits that she did of three different police forces
Yeah.
in the UK.
Yeah. And I mean, the other one that hit controversy that hit the headlines in the UK was this repatriation of so-called Afghan translators, secretively, which was just boggled my mind. Is there anything? Well, I guess you probably don't know if that had happened in Ireland as well. Is there any suggestion that something similar may have occurred?
But you
Occurred?
see, isn't this the whole point? We
Mm,
are not a player on the geopolitical,
mm,
like,
mm.
landscape, and we're not a former colonial power. And so, therefore, I don't know why we feel compelled to get so involved.
Mm.
My theory is that, you know, we've never really fully integrated our true place, which is a tiny country on the edge of Europe, of no real geopolitical significance. So we're very obsessed with having some kind of brand. And our politicians feel like, we have to be the best little progressive country in the world, and we'll do anything for that pat on the head from Europe. And so, therefore, even though we had an opt out negotiated in the Lisbon Treaty, we didn't use it when it came to the EU Migration Pact. I mean, it's wild. Like, why not use your opt out? Like, Denmark has opted out. We could have opted out. And instead, we voted in Parliament, and it passed by a handful of votes. I mean, it was heartbreaking. And now we've ceded all control of this mechanism to Europe. It's been centralized. And we will have to pay for essentially the spreading out of migration, because obviously some countries like Italy, like Spain, I mean, they're so close to Africa, they're just at the sharp edge. But we are this little island on the very edge of Europe, so kind of inured in many respects. But of course, now we're getting a massive influx from coming over our land border with Britain, because it's not because of the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, it's highly ironic that we negotiated to have no border there, and now it's kind of
Come back to
backfired
Boston. Yeah.
dramatically just in terms of our sovereignty.
Again, I don't labor the point, but while Australia has a lot of problems, we just don't have the issue where a foreign country is determining our laws, at least directly. I mean, we're subject to the same NGOs and international organizations and stuff, but it's not like Jakarta is telling Sydney what, it's in the same sense. It just does boggle the mind a bit. You had a nice little article recently, I guess a somewhat theoretical critique, entitled "Intersectionality Cuts Both Ways" in Compact magazine, which I quite enjoyed. What was the point you were making in that article?
So it kind of percolated up because I studied intersectionality back in the day
Mm,
in college. I took it as part of comparative law, and I took comparative law just for the pure joy of it, really. And we did amazing things. Like I remember we studied the Abrahamic religions from a legal point of view. It
mm,
was a fascinating subject to do. And part of it was feminism, and part of feminism was the sidebar called intersectionality.
mm,
And all it was a tool of analysis whereby you had to be mindful that a black woman in America would be experiencing, let's say, sex discrimination based on her sex, but also race discrimination based on her race. And so therefore, those two things intersected to create a different subjective experience for her.
yeah.
And that was it, and that's all it should have been. But I feel since then it's been completely weaponized, such that I'm now told that I am somehow there's such a thing called white feminism, or that, particularly the people who've loved it the most, of course, are the trans rights activists, because they're just
Yeah.
misogynist. And they're like, "Oh, white woman tears, stop crying your white woman tears if there's a man in the toilets."
Uh,
So I just saw this trend, and then it occurred to me, I can invert this to analyze what's happening with immigration with respect to the rights of women and girls. Because,
mm,
if there was a big group, let's say of 300 unknown Irish men in a camp beside my little girl's nursery school or um, school, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily be happy. And I think there would be an argument for saying that that's not good for society, having all these young men without jobs wandering around totally purposeless and bored. Um,
mm.
and so there's a risk there, but there's a heightened risk if these men are from countries, as I've said to you a moment ago, whereby the 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 norms are completely different. And so by virtue of my being a Western woman, out and about, totally free, therefore they present to me a double risk. A
Mm.
risk by just the vast numbers of men, but then also that element of the intersection of my Western behavior with their non-Western sensibilities.
My shorthand summary was that this intersectionality is always, I mean, it's kind of a Marxist analysis of relationships between the sexes and races and everything else, which is, I think, is, um, well, it's inadequate. But you were saying, well, look, who are the oppressors and the oppressees here? White women in Europe are the ones who are suffering the brunt of this. So can we just sort of, if you're going to take intersectionality on its own terms, then apply it and look at the reality of what is actually occurring here. I just thought it was a neat little way of well, using their words against them. But should intersectionality be taken seriously? I mean, is it? It seems to just dominate amongst HR departments and gender studies and critical race theories and Kimberly Crenshaw, the saint, the sort of originator of it is blessed be her name. It seems that seems to be the attitude. Is there something to it, or should we just would life be better if we just banned that word and its complete analysis? Um,
Or we're just like alive to it and inverted it. And
mm,
so I mean, it's completely intellectually dishonest as well, because it basically puts race above all else. And it kind of ignores class and sex. So for me, I would say that all women are vulnerable to male violence against women and girls, and that
mm,
intersectionality is a wedge. It's a
yeah,
wedge. So basically, elevates race above anything else. And that's why you end up with horrific and absurd outcomes whereby, one of the girls, I think it happened to a few of them, were intoxicated in a hotel bedroom with multiple Pakistani rapists, and the police were called because of the disturbance. She was arrested and they were let walk away because the police were so blinded by the race element that, race imbued these men with victimhood,
yeah,
regardless of what their eyes were telling them.
mm,
Similarly, that's why at an institutional level, social workers were blaming those white girls because they were seen as, because they were poor, because they were underclass, and because they were white. They were
mm,
seen as, oh, just difficult. Oh, they're just choosing to be prostitutes. And that's why also the men involved, who, after all, first and foremost, are just criminals and pimps, pedophilic pimps. But they were able to dehumanize them because to them, they were not on the same level as good Muslim girls. And they were seen as just, in lots of interviews, they're described as just meat. So this
yeah.
dehumanization of the white working class girls
Yeah, no,
because of that race
it's
element.
it's an ideology which yeah, dehumanizes, but also makes enforcement of the law tough because police see this hierarchy, and they're taught to read into people um, uh, background regarding their oppression based purely on their racial characteristics, which may or may not exist
The
at
other
all.
thing, I don't know if you saw this, but I said that in the article that, like, I don't feel like, I observe that when it comes to rapes that are happening across Europe, these men are using their race in order to perpetrate the crime because that's why they're doing it. But then they're using their race a second time to mitigate.
Mm,
And as a lawyer, I find that fascinating that
mm,
they're getting away with it. So what you'll see is I've given you the stats. I mean, they're pretty bleak. So the race element is why it's happening
mm,
because of that, because of how they view white women and because of the juxtaposition with their own cultures and their own. But then when it comes to their trials, you see defense counsel making arguments like, oh, well, in their culture, da da da. Like there's a German case where a 15-year-old was gang raped.
mm.
And one of the arguments made by a psychologist in court was, oh, it was a sense of powerlessness because of his refugee status. So, like, are we actually all saying, is it the case that we're saying that the women and girls of the West should be just like essentially fodder, you know, like grist to the mill to this new altar of this new sacred pillar of progressivism? I mean, I feel like I've already been fighting this for like 5 years when it comes to trans. Like, how come there's a whole generation of girls who are being kind of offered up in this altar, and now we see this with mass force immigration, and I find it quite shocking, and I don't see it as a left-right issue. I mean,
You've alluded to it already, that the the press in Ireland is sort of inadequate in its coverage of many of these issues. Um, in the last week, the UK introduced the Online Safety Act, which I don't think people quite have expected to have the impact it has. Actually, it was passed, and now people are having to log on and the rest of it. Is this anything similar like that in Ireland? Or, I mean, what is just paint a picture for sort of your access to information via the web and the news media generally in that country.
um, so we haven't brought in age verification when it comes to pornography, and I absolutely applaud my neighbouring jurisdiction. I think it was just done beautifully
Mm,
and immediately and without much fuss, and that's how it should be done. We have not managed to do that. Dare I say, is it anything to do with the fact that MindGeek, who own Pornhub, are headquartered in Ireland? Now, my understanding is not much more than a PO box just to move profits
is that right?
through
I didn't notice that.
through our jurisdiction and obviously benefit from our tax
Tax
breaks.
rate. Yeah.
However, we do have another kind of elephant in the room when it comes to this topic, which is the Digital Services Act. Ireland has become a hub of censorship for all of big tech across Europe. And what
Yeah.
that would mean is if, say, a party loses their platform, the Twitter platform in Germany, that will be done from Ireland. Dublin will be the hub for all those decisions. Um, and you may have seen the US State Department is not very happy about this. They've just issued an opinion around this. They don't want American citizens and American companies to lose their own constitutional rights to free speech.
Mm,
Um, and Ireland is really caught in the crosshairs now of like,
yeah.
America, upon whom, our direct foreign investment, like without direct foreign investment in Ireland, we are literally, Albania. We don't have a plan B, but we are as wealthy as we are because of tech and pharma
Mm.
headquartering here. And so it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. I mean, I think there'll be lots of test cases brought. I myself will be, I think, hopefully involved in that
Mm.
side of things. But then the other issue is with regard to pornography, like I've been working up.
It's broader than that, though. My understanding is that it's caught things in the UK like 4chan, and people are having trouble logging on to not just porn sites, like shut them down, whatever, but other things as well. Like so much of this legislation, there's creep, and it often expands or is interpreted well beyond what was originally intended. Right? I mean, I think it's only been a week in, but there's already reports and complaints and things coming out of the
Mhm.
of the UK on that. So anyway, who knows? I suppose. We shall see.
Okay. Like with regard to porn, I'm planning a symposium in Dublin for next year
Mm,
because I do think Dublin is a good place to hold it because obviously that's where MindGeek is headquartered, and also because of the DSA kind of censorship architecture being
mm,
centralized in Dublin. And there's increasing awareness, of it as a public health crisis in terms of everything from, I mean, I in terms of public health, there's increasing awareness amongst doctors that, extreme sexual practices are being normalized due to porn, and then it's causing injuries to young women.
mm,
I think personally, as a criminal barrister, I would argue that porn is making pedophiles out of ordinary men who get addicted to porn. I
mm.
think it's also making rapists out of young men who don't understand consent because porn doesn't really portray consent
It's also
or
an
female agency.
absolutely combustible mix when you have third world immigration who have had their minds their view of Western women created online, and then they're actually transported there. It's completely unrealistic representation of how most are. It's just asking for trouble. There's one thing to sort of like change the native population and adolescent boys and exposure to pornography and the like, but I think it's another thing entirely when you throw those two things together.
Yeah, and I think India is a good case study for that, isn't it?
Mm,
The rise of horrific rape in India, and that is, I think, due to that heady cocktail of extreme misogyny mixed with then pornography.
yeah, and sexual repression, and I don't know,
Yeah,
a lot of different things going on there. Just to change gears entirely, how
yeah,
do you? I mean, I like Irish history. My godfather Conor O'Consmith sends me more books than I can read on
yeah.
on on the place. Um, how do you think this period will be viewed in Irish history, or is it without historical parallel?
I would see parallels to. I mean, my view is that we've segued from one theocracy to the next. You know, from a period of kind of obsessiveness with being the best Catholics in the world
Mm,
and wanting that recognition from Rome to now, our politicians are obsessed with us being the best progressive country in the world and needing
is that
that
right?
kind of recognition from both Europe and from just the supernatural, supranational national institutions like the UN. But I mean, I would say there's also some green shoots, and it is due to activism on the ground bubbling up, and making things political. So, for instance, you and I were talking about the constitutional amendments that was defeated, and I must say, defeated by a margin of 74.8%.
Yeah, massive.
It was a landslide victory for the people, and it was the first time they really got to show the government how they really feel about weird and unwanted ideologies,
Mm,
and how they really feel about their mother, of course, as well, and about the family and about marriage. But the UN has since come back. It was actually CEDAW came back, and I know for a fact Rima Salim, the rapporteur for women and girls, does not agree with this, but they have come back saying, would Ireland mind rerunning the referendum,
oh God, they need to
rewording
go
it
think of that.
until they get a better result, get the result they want, which is outrageous, to your point about sovereignty. I mean, it's outrageous. But luckily, our Taoiseach, our Prime Minister, has said, no, that's not going to happen. Um, and I take him at his word. I have no reason to doubt him. But I mean, this is the kind of, as a small country that seems to have this kind of weakness when it comes to trying to be on the world stage, we are kind of caught in those crosshairs. But so I think we will look back at it and say, I certainly, like, the reason my organization is called The Countess Didn't Fight for This is because I feel like she was an extraordinary woman who transgressed all the barriers of sex, class, and race, and fought in 1916 and was a military leader and went on to become the first ever female minister of state in a modern democracy. But her vision of a republic and all the visionaries, vision of all those rebels was never really realized, because as soon as we sort of wrestled the keys back from the church and freed ourselves from, very kind of social control, let's say, we
Mm,
just handed the keys to the 40,000 NGOs. who are essentially pushing a different drug, but it just another ideology, I would argue, which is far more damaging.
Mm.
And with that comes the sacred pillars of, radical progressivism, and the two most damaging ones are trans and immigration, for sure.
Yeah. I've heard someone draw a parallel between Ireland and Spain, which, famously Spain had Franco and it was up these attempted to be a highly traditionalist Catholic society, and Ireland wasn't a dictatorship, obviously, but it was somewhat similar. And yet, once that all broke down in the 80s or late 70s, then both countries went far, far to the left of many other countries in Europe that didn't have that sort of traditional Catholic heritage, and it's like they overcorrected, or they went, they just threw it all away when they should have sort of had adopted. There were lots of good parts to that that should have been preserved and I don't know, maybe adjusted slightly for the times or what have. But what next for you? Where are you devoting most of your time, and how do you rate your chances of success with the various campaigns that you are involved with?
Um, I mean, I think we're going to win. I think we are going to win. I think Ireland is just a juggernaut that takes time to turn, and that's partly because of the media and legal framework. Without doubt, the permanent government, the public sector is completely ideologically captured. So that's, I think, what makes it slower, and the media doesn't really give much airtime to both sides at all, if at all. But we're also a small country, and things spread virally fast, So I absolutely am an optimist. I think we can absolutely turn this around. Um, I've drafted legislation to amend the GRA, which essentially unlatches the effect of the gender recognition certificate from prison. So that would be my first kind of.
GRA sorry, just the GRA.
It's a
What's
piece
that?
of paper that says you change your sex.
Oh, right, okay. Oh, gender
Gender recognition
recognition. Oh,
certificate. Yeah, and the Gender Recognition Act is the
okay,
prime
got it. Yeah.
legislation. Um, so I think this will all come crumbling down, like the house of cards that it is. But I think it will take time. There are test cases which will come to court, and they will have a huge impact because that will all be reported. And finally, the media will have to report that. Um, in terms of myself, I mean, I continue to work as a barrister and focus on my family, and then do this all of the time otherwise. I mean, I ran for the Senate. I kind of, as a non-household name, I did quite well.
Mm.
I loved the experience. I see myself running again in the future. And who knows? I mean, that might come sooner than later because this government could collapse. It's not, there are kind of fault lines there. Um, and I do think kind of politics is where it's at in terms of moving the dial. You can scream into the void forever, but you're better off being inside the chamber.
Yeah. Oh, I was gonna just ask one follow-up on that. I mean, because Ireland, like Australia, I think as well, hasn't seen a credible populist nationalist party arise in the same way that they have arisen in many European countries, and indeed, well, at least you could argue with the transformation of the Republican Party in the United States. Why is that, do you think?
It seems to be very fragmented, the nationalist movement. Um, they're kind of doing all the things that I just instinctively knew not to do with the Countess. I mean, if I was to talk about all the infighting and all the, you know, like attacks from the socialist feminists that I've weathered, I mean, it might be interesting reading, but my God, wouldn't it just distract everyone from the actual cause, from the
Yeah.
mission? And it would
Yeah.
just make everything look like a joke. So I think that's one of the problems. It's just constant drama. I mean, I can't even keep up. Then you have parties like Aim to, which should be the great hope, but they're kind of very on message to a degree. I mean, they do things like they do parliamentary questions, which then give us new information, but they don't really seem to campaign hard or take a position. What's needed is someone to take a position, but to take a position, but in a palatable way that brings the middle classes with you. And
mm,
no one seems to be joining those dots. Like, nothing will change if the middle classes aren't kind of impacted by this and aren't kind of exercised by this. And the reason that we are kind of in stasis with the Uni Party, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, is that frankly, it suits lots of people. They're perfectly happy with the status quo. They you know, they read the Irish Times every day. They watch the 9 o'clock news on RT. They're very happy with being fed this narrative, and their own lives aren't impacted, you know?
mm,
And I think that's the problem we face. We have to try and break out and make the argument, but make the argument in a way that feels safe, reasonable, that is not racist, and that
mm,
is evidence-based,
mm. Yeah.
and that people can come behind. Because at the moment, like, for example, Conor McGregor, I believe is a complete gift to the establishment, because so many people are like, "Well, I if that who's making the argument, I don't want anything to do with him." You
Yeah.
know? Or if there's, like, a protest and then it kind of descends into violence or there's a big fracas, people are turned off by that. I mean, like, come on, we're not the French. You know, Irish people are not like our cultural kind of norm is to kind of keep the head down, say nothing.
Mm.
So it's going to be much harder to get us kind of up in
Yeah.
arms.
Yeah, but look, this is why I always think what's lacking here. There is dissatisfaction in a whole host of areas in Australia because of, um, like, uh, progressivism or extreme liberalism or whatever, however you want to characterize it. And you want the solution to have a coherent, articulate response, not just to be like an incoherent protest. And so, all the work you're doing, it's all very valuable, so people can, you know, work out exactly, get to the root of what's going on in Ireland and elsewhere. And I've enjoyed chatting to you, Leish. How do I? I'll pop all the stuff that the usual countess and your links in the show notes so people can check it out. But look forward to keeping in touch. And thanks again for making time.
Thanks a million. Thank you. Thanks for having
Yes,
me.
bye.